The stagecoach stopped without warning. No town, no station, no sign of anything man-made except a dirt road that disappeared into the distance like a rumor. Wren Ashby pressed her face toward the small window and saw only grass, an ocean of it, pale gold and endless, moving in long, slow waves under a sky so wide it looked like something out of a painting that had never quite dried. The driver climbed down without a word. He pulled her single valise from the back, set it on the ground with a sound that was not quite a drop but close enough to be an insult, and climbed back up to his seat. Wren stepped down from the coach. The ground was harder than she expected. The wind hit her immediately. Not violent, just constant. The kind of wind that did not ask permission and did not apologize. She turned to look at the driver. He was already facing forward. "This is it?" she asked. "End of the line for you," he said, and clicked his tongue at the horses. She watched the coach move away. She watched it grow smaller. She watched it until it rounded a bend in the road and disappeared behind a low rise of land. And then she stood in the silence that followed and understood, perhaps for the first time since she had agreed to this, exactly how far from everything she had ever known she truly was. Behind her, at the end of a long, flat stretch of open ground, stood a house. It was not grand. It was not charming. It was the kind of structure that said plainly, "I was built to last, not to impress." 2 stories of weathered timber, a wide front porch with 1 chair on it, a barn off to the left that was larger than the house, several outbuildings in various states of repair, and beyond all of it, rolling land that ran to the horizon without apology. Wren did not move toward it right away. She set her valise down at her feet and reached into the pocket of her traveling coat. The envelope was there, as it had been every day for the past 3 weeks. Worn soft at the corners from handling, the seal long since broken and pressed back into place. She did not take it out. She only touched it, the way a person touches something they are not sure whether to keep or burn. The contract inside was 9 pages long. She had read it enough times to know every clause, every condition, every careful phrase that turned a human life into something resembling a business arrangement. 90 days, that was the term. 90 days of lawful cohabitation, at the end of which both parties could review the terms and either proceed to a permanent arrangement or dissolve the agreement with no legal consequence to either side. 90 days. She had counted them out on the back page of a letter she never sent. 90 small marks in a row, like a sentence she was writing 1 word at a time. The wind shifted. She tucked her hand back into her pocket. She picked up her valise and walked toward the house. Her name had been Wren Calloway before she married Thomas Ashby, and Wren Ashby for the 2 years of their marriage, and Wren Ashby still after he was gone, because there was no one to tell her to be anything else. Thomas had been a good man in the uncomplicated way that some men were. Steady, quiet, faithful to his word and his work, without much imagination but without cruelty either. He had loved her in the particular way of a man who does not know he is doing it until it is too late to say so. She had loved him back in the same way. He went into the mine on a Tuesday morning and did not come out. That was the whole of it. There was no story to tell beyond that fact, no narrative that made it mean something, no lesson she could hold up to the light and say, "Here, this is what I learned." He went in, and he did not come out. And the world continued turning without consulting her on the matter. She had been 25 years old. She had been a school teacher for 3 years before the marriage, and she went back to teaching after, because the work was familiar and the children were honest and the schoolroom was a place where she understood the rules. She was good at it. She was patient in a way that came from something deeper than disposition. The patience of someone who had learned that most things cannot be rushed, that understanding comes in its own time, that the right word said at the right moment can do what 100 wrong words could not. But teaching in the town where Thomas had died meant living inside the shape of his absence every day. The mine sat on the edge of town, like a wound that would not close. She could see the entrance from the schoolroom window if she stood at a certain angle, which she learned not to do. The accident that changed everything had happened on an ordinary afternoon in late autumn, the kind of day that looked pleasant from a distance and bit hard up close. She had been driving a small cart back from the neighboring farm, taking the long road because the short one was muddy from 3 days of rain. One of her students, a boy named Eli, 7 years old, with a habit of losing his left boot and not mentioning it until they were already halfway home, had been riding beside her, chattering about something she could no longer remember. The horse startled at something in the brush. The cart went sideways. Wren had held on. Eli had not. There was an investigation. There was a verdict. There was a document, signed and filed and declared official, that said no fault had been found, that the accident had been beyond any reasonable control, that Wren Ashby bore no legal responsibility for what had occurred. She had read that document once and put it in a drawer and never opened the drawer again. The law could say what it liked. She had been holding the reins. She had stayed in the town for another year after that because leaving felt like running, and she was not built for running. She taught. She kept the schoolroom clean. She visited the boys' family every Sunday with whatever she could bring. A loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, her own silent presence, which was all she had left to offer. His mother never asked her to stop coming. His father never asked her to come. They existed in a careful arrangement of grief that had no name and no resolution and no end in sight. And then Edmund had come. Her brother Edmund was 2 years older than Wren and had spent those 2 years, and all the years before them, developing a talent for finding the path of least resistance through any situation that required effort. He was charming in the way that certain people were charming. Not because they cared about you, but because they needed something, and charm was the most efficient tool available. Wren had known this about him since she was 8 years old. She had loved him anyway, the way you love the parts of your family that disappoint you, which is to say, helplessly, without illusion, and without the ability to stop. Edmund had debts. Edmund always had debts. But this particular set of debts had teeth, and the men who held them had made their impatience clear in terms that Edmund described to Wren in a careful, measured voice that told her he had rehearsed this conversation several times before arriving. He had signed the contract on her behalf while she was still recovering from a fever that had kept her in bed for 9 days the previous winter. He had forged her name. A small violation, he said, barely worth mentioning, really just a technicality. On a mail-order bride agreement with a man named Cormac Vane, owner of a working ranch several days' journey west. The fee paid for the agreement had covered Edmund's most pressing obligation. He was very sorry. He hoped she would understand. Wren had understood. She had understood that she could refuse, and that refusing would mean Edmund faced consequences she did not want to imagine, and that Edmund was the only family she had left in the world, which was not a good reason to go, but was the reason she went. She had also understood, sitting across from her brother at the kitchen table of the house she was renting by the month, that she was tired. Tired of the schoolroom window and the mine on the horizon. Tired of Sunday visits and silent grief. tired of the town that held the shape of every loss she had ever suffered, like a vessel that had been filled too many times. 90 days. She had done the arithmetic. She would go. She would fulfill the contract in good faith. At the end of 90 days, she would exercise the dissolution clause, which was perfectly legal, which required no explanation, which would leave both parties free to proceed with their lives. Edmund would be safe. The man named Cormac Vane would have his 90 days of documented cohabitation, which was apparently what he needed for some land arrangement she did not fully understand. And Wren would have whatever came after: a new town, a new schoolroom, a window that did not look out at anything she recognized. It was a plan. It was not a good plan, but it was a plan. And plans had the advantage of forward motion, which was what she needed most. She had packed her valise in one evening. At the very bottom, before anything else, she had placed a school book, a small primer with a torn cover and a name written on the inside in the large, uneven handwriting of a child who was learning to form letters. Eli. She did not know why she brought it. She had not been able to leave it behind. The man standing on the porch of the house was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say what she had expected. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way that came from work rather than intention, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that had been shaped by weather into something angular and still. He wore a work shirt the color of old pine and held a hammer in his right hand, which suggested she had interrupted something, though he did not look irritated. He looked the way a person looks when they are carefully not looking any particular way. He watched her walk the last 50 yards to the house without moving. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at him. He looked down at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched longer than was strictly comfortable. She had thought about this moment during the 3 weeks of travel. She had rehearsed several versions of it: polite, practical, clear. She had not rehearsed this version, which was apparently the version where they simply looked at each other while the wind moved through the grass around them. "Mr. Vane," she said. "Miss Ashby," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not expend itself on unnecessary sound. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything on this land, not unkindly, but with the careful attention of a man calculating what something would cost him. She did not flinch from it. She was used to being assessed. She had been assessed by the school board that hired her, by the town that watched her teach, by the people who came to the mine on the day of the accident and formed their quiet opinions. She was 30 years old, and she had learned to stand straight while it happened. "Your room is at the end of the hall," he said. "There's a lock on the inside of the door." "Thank you," she said. He stepped back to let her pass. She carried her own valise up the steps and through the front door without asking for help, which was not a statement of pride so much as a statement of fact. She did not need help. She was capable of carrying what belonged to her. The inside of the house was clean and spare and organized in the way that places are organized by people who live alone and have developed systems to avoid thinking too hard about things. There was a sitting room with 2 chairs and a table and a bookshelf that held more books than she expected. A kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke. A staircase that creaked on the 3rd step. A hallway at the top with 3 doors, one of which stood open to reveal a room with a window that faced west. She set her valise on the bed and looked around. The room was plain and clean. The quilt on the bed was worn soft from washing. The window looked out over open land, gold and brown under the afternoon light, running all the way to where the sky came down to meet it. She stood at that window for a long moment. Then she opened her valise and began to unpack, placing each thing in its practical location. Dress on the hook behind the door, boots under the chair, the small tin of useful items, needle and thread, a folded packet of herbs for headaches, on the shelf above the wash basin, and at the last, the school book. She held it for a moment, then tucked it at the bottom of the drawer in the small bedside table, under everything else. She found the lock on the inside of the door, tried it once to be sure it worked, and then did not lock it. Not yet. Supper that first evening was a test of endurance for both of them, though neither acknowledged it as such. Cormac Vane cooked. This surprised her. The meal was simple: beans, salt pork, cornbread, but it was prepared with the competence of someone who had been doing it alone for long enough that it had become second nature. He set 2 plates on the table and sat down across from her without ceremony. They ate. The clock on the wall ticked. The wind moved around the corners of the house with a low, constant sound that she would later learn to sleep through and now could only listen to. Halfway through the meal, he set something on the table beside her plate. It was a folded piece of paper. She looked at it, then at him. "A copy of the contract," he said. "My signature's already on it. I'll need yours before you turn in." She unfolded it. She did not read it. She had read it enough times to see it clearly with her eyes closed. She looked at the space waiting for her signature at the bottom of the final page, then picked up the pen he had placed beside the paper and signed her name. He watched her do it without reading a single word. Something moved across his face. Not suspicion, not quite. Closer to recognition. "You've seen this before," he said. "I know what's in it," she said. He folded the paper and put it in the chest pocket of his shirt. He did not ask how she knew. She did not offer to explain. They finished the meal in the same careful quiet they had started it in, and when she stood to clear the plates, he did not stop her, and when she washed them at the basin, he sat at the table with a cup of coffee and did not offer to help, and she did not expect him to. It was, she thought, an entirely reasonable beginning. She lay awake for a long time that night. The room held the kind of darkness that was different from town darkness, deeper, more complete, without the small ambient light of lanterns on other streets and other windows. The stars were extraordinary. She could see them through her window, thick as spilled salt across the black sky, more of them than she had known existed. She was arranging the coming days in her mind, 89 remaining, laid out like work to be done, when she heard something. It came from outside, distant enough to be gentle, the sound of a guitar, a slow melody, unhurried, picking its way through a progression that was not quite any song she recognized, but had the feeling of something that had been played so many times it had worn grooves in the air. There was no performance in it. Whoever was playing was not playing for an audience. They were playing the way people talk to themselves when words will not do. The way the mind circles something it cannot resolve, returning to it again and again through the one language that asks nothing back. Wren sat up in bed. She listened. The music came from the direction of the barn, low and patient against the backdrop of wind and night sound. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling and told herself that it was not her business, that this man and whatever he carried were not her concern, that she was here for 90 days and not a day more. She told herself that. She listened until the music stopped. She lay in the quiet that followed for a while longer. Then she closed her eyes. Outside, the stars turned slowly in their ancient patterns, And somewhere across the yard in the barn that was larger than the house, a man had put down his guitar and gone to bed. She did not know why the sound of it stayed with her the way it did. She did not know why her hand, when she finally fell asleep, was not resting near the lock on the door as she had expected it to be, but flat open on the quilt beside her, fingers slightly apart, as if waiting to hold something she had not yet been offered. She slept, and the land outside lay quiet and enormous under the stars, and the grass moved in the dark, and the house stood as it had always stood, built to last, not to impress, keeping its patience the way all patient things keep patience, waiting. The first week passed the way cold water passes through the hands, present, then gone, leaving only the sensation of having been there. Wren learned the rhythms of the house the way she had always learned new places, by watching, by listening, by paying attention to the small details that told the truth about a life more honestly than any conversation could. Cormac rose before the sky changed color. She would hear the front door close, not slammed, never slammed, just pulled shut with the particular care of a man who had learned to move through the world without disturbing it. And then the sound of his boots crossing the yard toward the barn. By the time she came downstairs, the coffee was made. The pot was never empty. He always left enough. She did not know if this was courtesy or habit. She suspected it was both, and that for him there was no meaningful difference between the two. She made her own breakfast. She cleaned what needed cleaning. She took stock of the kitchen with the methodical attention of someone who understood that a household ran on organization, and that organization required knowing what you had and where it was kept. The pantry was well stocked but without system, a practical man's collection of necessary things, arranged in the order they had been put down rather than any order that made them easy to find. She reorganized it in the first 3 days without asking permission, moving the flour to the lower shelf where the weight made sense, grouping the medicinal things together near the window where the light was better. Cormac noticed on the 4th morning. He stood in the pantry doorway for a moment, looking at the changed shelves with an expression she could not quite read. He did not say anything. He reached for the coffee tin, which was now on the 2nd shelf instead of the 3rd, found it without searching, and went back to the stove. That was all. But the next morning, there was a new tin beside the coffee. Dried herbs she recognized as useful for a dozen things, wrapped neatly and labeled in handwriting that was careful without being delicate. She looked at it for a long time before she put it where it belonged. They were, she understood, conducting a negotiation that neither of them had agreed to conduct. It happened in the language of small gestures, of things placed and things moved, of space shared without comment. It was the language of two people who had decided, for their own separate reasons, that words were expensive and should not be spent carelessly. She was fluent in that language. She had been speaking it for years. On the 8th day, she made a mark in the door frame of her room. She had not planned to. She had been standing at the window in the early morning, looking out at the land coming slowly visible as the light grew, and she had thought, 8 days down. And then, without fully deciding to, she had taken the small penknife she kept in her traveling kit and pressed a thin line into the wood of the door frame, low enough to be hidden by the door when it was open. One mark, thin as a whisper. She stood back and looked at it. Then she went downstairs. That evening at supper, Cormac set something beside her plate. Not the contract this time. A small pitcher of water with a sprig of something green and feathery in it. Not decorative, exactly. More like accidental. The kind of thing that happens when a person is not quite paying attention to themselves. He sat down and began to eat without mentioning it. She looked at the sprig, then at him, then back at her plate. She poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher. She did not say anything about the herb floating in it. He did not say anything about it either. Between them, the quiet was exactly the same as every other evening. And also, she noticed, not quite. The trouble with the horse happened on the 12th day. Wren was crossing the yard from the house to the small garden at the back when she heard it. A sound from the barn that was half cry and half collision. The sound of something large in distress. She changed direction without thinking. She had grown up near horses. She knew the difference between a horse being difficult and a horse being afraid, and what she heard was fear. Inside the barn, Cormac had the bay gelding, his working horse, a big solid animal that under normal circumstances moved through the world with reliable calm, cornered against the far wall. The horse was not calm now. It was wide-eyed and trembling, its injured front leg held slightly off the ground, its body bunched and ready to bolt in any direction that presented itself. Cormac had the lead rope, but the horse had stopped trusting the lead rope. It was trusting nothing and no one, operating entirely on the ancient mathematics of pain plus confinement equals danger. Cormac was holding on. He was strong and experienced, and he was holding on. But holding on was not going to be enough. Wren came through the barn door and assessed the situation in the time it took to draw one breath. She did not ask permission. There was no time for permission. She moved to the left, away from Cormac, away from the horse's line of sight, and she began to talk. Not to Cormac, to the horse. Her voice dropped to the register she had learned from watching her uncle work with frightened animals when she was a girl. Low even, relentless in its steadiness. Not soothing exactly. More like a thing that does not move. A fixed point. Something in the chaos that stays the same. The words did not matter. She knew that. It was the pattern of them, the rhythm, the refusal to be hurried by anything the horse did. She kept moving, slowly, in a wide arc, not toward the horse, but parallel to it, giving it a direction to track with those white-rimmed eyes. The trembling did not stop, but it slowed. She kept talking. She moved closer by increments small enough to be unmeasurable. At some point, she could not have said when, the horse's breathing began to synchronize with the pace of her voice. Not calm, but something adjacent to calm. Something that could be worked with. She got her hand on its neck. The horse flinched. She kept her hand where it was, kept her voice where it was, and waited. The flinch did not come. Again, she worked her way down to the leg, running her hand along the shoulder, the foreleg, finding the wound by the heat of it before she saw it. A gash from something in the fence, not deep, but ragged, already inflamed at the edges. She examined it with her fingers the way she had examined spelling errors in student work. Systematically, without alarm, noting what was there without adding anything to it. "I need the clean cloth," she said, without looking up. "Second shelf in the pantry, left side. And the iodine. It's in the tin next to the dried chamomile." She heard Cormac leave the barn. She heard him come back. He placed the items in her outstretched hand without touching her hand, with a precision that told her he was paying close attention. She worked for 20 minutes. The horse stood for it. Not happily, but it stood, because something in the quality of her presence had persuaded it that standing was the better option. When she finished, she straightened up slowly, gave the horse's neck one final flat-palmed stroke, and stepped back. Cormac was standing behind her. He still had the lead rope, though it was slack now, unnecessary. She turned and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the careful neutrality of supper, not the assessing look from the porch steps. Something quieter than both of those. Something that did not have a ready name. She pushed her hair back from her face. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when there was something to do. It was afterward that they sometimes failed her. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. She moved toward the barn door. "From someone who understood that panic doesn't help anything." She walked back to the house. She made it to the kitchen before she set both hands flat on the table and let out a breath that had been waiting for somewhere to go. Her fingers trembled slightly against the wood. Not from fear, not from the exertion, from the release of holding everything still for so long. From the particular cost of being the calm thing in a frightened room. She stood like that until her hands were steady again. She did not know that Cormac had watched her walk back across the yard from the barn door. She did not know that he stood there for a long moment after she went inside, looking at the closed kitchen door with the expression of a man who has just seen something he does not yet know what to do with. That evening he poured her coffee without being asked. He set it in front of her at the table and went back to his chair by the window with his own cup, and opened the book he had been working through. Something dense and technical about land management she had gathered from the spine and read, and she sat across the room with her own reading, and they existed in the same space in a way that was, for the first time, not something that needed managing. She noticed the difference. She filed it away without examining it too closely. The letter from Edmund arrived on the 17th day. She recognized his handwriting on the envelope before she even opened it. The particular flourish he put on capital letters, the way his E's looked like they were reaching for something just out of grasp. She took the letter to the kitchen and read it standing up, which was how she read things she expected to be unpleasant. Edmund did not ask how she was. He had never been very interested in how she was. He asked whether the arrangement was proceeding satisfactorily, and whether she had had occasion to observe the terms of the man's landholding, and whether she thought it might be possible, if things were going smoothly, to mention to Mr. Vane that a small secondary agreement regarding certain temporary rights might be of mutual benefit to all parties involved. She read it twice, then she folded it once and again, until it was a small square of paper, and she opened the door of the stove and put it inside. She watched it catch. She watched it burn down to ash. She closed the stove door and turned around, and found Cormac in the kitchen doorway, having apparently come in from outside while she was reading. He looked at the stove. He looked at her. "Family letter," she said. "Nothing important." He looked at her for a moment longer than the sentence required. Then he nodded and went to hang his hat on the hook by the door. That evening at supper, he did something he had not done before. He looked up from his plate, not at her exactly, but in her direction, in the way of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether to say it. She waited. "The Holt place is about a mile north," he said. "She brings things over sometimes. Dorothy Holt, widow. Been out here longer than anyone." Wren waited to see if there was more to this. "She'll come whether I tell her about you or not," he said. "Thought you should know before she just walks in." "Noted," Wren said. He went back to his plate. She understood that this was, in its particular way, a consideration. He was preparing her for something so that she would not be caught off guard. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. Dorothy Holt arrived the next morning with a pie and an agenda, and made no effort to conceal either. She was perhaps 60 years old, with white hair pulled back in the practical style of a woman who had stopped caring about aesthetics some years ago and had not missed them. Her face had the particular quality of faces that have spent decades in outdoor light, not aged so much as clarified, the way a piece of wood becomes more itself after years of weather. She walked into the kitchen without knocking, set the pie on the table, and looked at Wren with the directness of someone who had long since decided that life was too short for the approach angle variety of conversation. "You must be the bride," she said. "I'm Wren Ashby," Wren said. "Same thing," said Dorothy Holt. She pulled out a chair and sat down in it as if she owned it, which she arguably did in the way that people who have known a place from the beginning own it by prior claim. "You look like a woman who's counting something." Wren set the kettle on. "I don't know what you mean." "Course you do." Dorothy looked at her with calm, unhurried eyes. Cormac's first wife, Margaret, her name was. She had a room in that house that looked like a person who was always getting ready to leave. Everything folded twice. Nothing put away that couldn't be picked up in 5 minutes. I used to watch her and think, that woman's already got one foot somewhere else. She just hasn't decided where yet. She paused. "You remind me of her some." The kettle was not yet boiling. Wren gave it a moment. "I'm sorry about her," she said, because it was true, and because she did not have anything else to offer. "So is he," said Dorothy. 3 years sorry, and not done yet. She looked toward the window. "He's a good man. I don't say that about many people. I've known him long enough to mean it." Wren set 2 cups on the table. "That's useful to know," she said, which was true in a way she was not prepared to examine. Dorothy stayed for an hour. She talked about the land, about the seasons, about the particular cruelty and particular beauty of this place in ways that were neither romantic nor bitter, but simply accurate. She talked about the land regulation, the provision that required a working rancher without an heir or a lawful spouse to demonstrate a stable domestic arrangement or face periodic review of his holding rights. She explained this the way she explained everything, without ceremony, as a fact about the world that existed independently of anyone's feelings about it. "He doesn't talk about it," Dorothy said, pulling on her coat to leave. "But it's real. That land's been reviewed twice already. 3rd review comes up when the agreement period ends. You understand what that means." "I understand," Wren said. Dorothy looked at her at the door. "I told Margaret once, a person can come somewhere for the wrong reason and still find the right thing when they get there." She paused. She didn't listen. People generally don't until it's too late. She left the way she had come, without waiting for a response, which was, Wren was beginning to understand, entirely characteristic. On the 23rd day, it rained. It rained all morning and into the afternoon, the kind of persistent, windless rain that made the outdoors feel sealed off and made the inside of a house feel smaller and more inhabited than usual. Cormac finished what inside work there was to do by mid-morning, and then sat at the table with a piece of harness that needed mending, working through it with the patient repetition of a man who knew how to make himself useful when circumstances removed his usual outlets. Wren read. She had found the bookshelf in the sitting room to be better stocked than she had expected, and she had been working her way through it in the evenings by lamplight. On this particular afternoon, she brought a book to the kitchen table, where the light was better and the stove kept the chill manageable. And she read while Cormac worked at his end of the same table, and the rain came down outside. An hour passed, perhaps more. "What is it?" he asked. She looked up. He was not looking at her. His hands were still moving through the harness work. "Philosophy," she said. "Older. A collection of essays about the nature of habit and intention." He was quiet for a moment. What does it say about them? She considered the page she was on. That most people confuse the two. That we think we're acting from intention when we're mostly acting from habit, and that the difference only becomes visible when something interrupts the pattern. He made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal. More like, I am filing that somewhere useful. Read some, he said. She looked at him. He had still not looked up from the harness. She found a passage that seemed like a reasonable place to enter and began to read aloud. Her voice settled into the measured pace she used when reading to students. Not performed, not flat, just present. The rain came down. The stove ticked. He kept working. When she reached the end of the section, she stopped. Keep going, he said. She turned the page. She read for the better part of an hour. He finished the harness and moved to another piece of equipment, then another, the work serving as the kind of occupation that allows the mind to be elsewhere. When she finally set the book down because the light was shifting and her voice had earned a rest, he stood and moved to put the equipment away. At the door of the kitchen, he paused. If it rains tomorrow, he said, without turning around, you don't have to wait to be asked. He went out to check the barn before supper. Wren sat at the table with the closed book in her hands and the rain on the window and a feeling she did not name, because naming it seemed premature and possibly dangerous. She filed it away and went to start supper. It did not rain the next day, but he asked her to read again anyway. He said it without looking up from the fence post he was working on when she passed through the yard after the morning's lesson. Just that book, if you were inclined. And then he went back to the post. She was inclined. That evening after supper, she opened the philosophy text at the kitchen table and read for an hour while Cormac sharpened tools at the far end of the same table. The sound of the whetstone steady and rhythmic beneath her voice. The essay she had found was on the subject of thresholds, the particular quality of the moments just before a change, when the change has already become inevitable but has not yet made itself visible. She read it carefully, measuring her pace, letting the ideas have the room they needed. When she paused at the end of a long passage, Cormac said, without breaking the rhythm of the whetstone, "Read that last part again." She did. "The change has already happened," he said quietly, still working. "The person just hasn't caught up to it yet." "That's the argument," she said. He set the tool down and looked at the far wall for a moment in the way he looked at things he was turning over in his mind. "Feels true," he said finally. Then he picked up the next tool and went back to work. Wren looked at him, at the angle of his face in the lamplight, at the particular concentration he brought to everything he did, at the way the room had rearranged itself since she had arrived without anyone asking it to. She thought about thresholds. She went back to reading. She learned about his past in pieces, the way you learn about the land itself, not from any single vantage point, but from moving through it, from what was visible in one light that was invisible in another. He had come to this land from somewhere east, not the east she had come from, but a different east, a cattle country east, a place of dry grass and flat horizons, and the particular loneliness of men who work land that is never quite their own. He had worked for other people's ranches for a decade, saving what he could, learning everything there was to learn about the work without the expense of having land to practice on. He had been careful and methodical in the way of a person who has identified what they want and understands that wanting it loudly will not make it arrive any faster. Margaret had been from the same country, the daughter of a rancher, which meant she understood the work without romanticizing it, which Cormac had told Wren was rarer than you might think. They had known each other for 2 years before they married. which was long enough for the knowing to be real rather than the knowing of people who have decided they want to know each other and have arranged events accordingly. "We argued about everything," he said once, on an evening when they were sitting on the porch, and the light was doing something particular with the clouds over the western ridge. He said it without sadness, just as a fact. She had opinions, strong ones, about how things should be done, about what mattered, about when I was wrong, which was more often than I generally admitted. He paused. I got better at admitting it after she was gone. Too late to be useful. Wren thought about the things she had not said to Thomas, about the mornings she had been too tired or too preoccupied to look up from whatever she was doing when he left for work, about the last Tuesday, unremarkable in every way that mattered except one. "I think," she said carefully, "that the people we love carry a great deal of what we mean to say to them, more than we ever get around to saying. And I think, I hope, that they know." Cormac was quiet for a moment, looking at the clouds. "She would have liked you," he said. It was, she realized afterward, the highest thing he had said to her yet. The man from the land office came on a gray morning near the end of the third week. Wren was in the small garden at the back of the house when she heard the horse in the yard. She came around the side of the building in time to see Cormac meeting the visitor at the fence, a man in a coat that was too good for this landscape, carrying a leather case with brass fittings. They spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. She could not hear the words from where she stood, but she could read the conversation in the set of Cormac's shoulders, in the way his weight shifted, in the particular stillness he maintained that she was beginning to recognize as the external face of something being compressed. The man from the land office left. Cormac stood at the fence for a moment after, looking at nothing in particular. Then he turned and saw her watching. Neither of them said anything. He walked back to the barn. She went back to the garden. That evening at supper, he set the contract down on the table. He tapped it once with one finger, not a gesture of impatience, more like a man marking a point on a map. 70 days left, he said. 67, she said. He looked at her. "I've been keeping track," she said, which was true, and which she had not intended to say. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise. Something slower than surprise and less comfortable. He looked at the contract, then back at her, and she could see him deciding something, what to ask or whether to ask it, and then deciding against it. He folded the contract and put it back in his shirt pocket. 67, he said. He went back to his food. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving across the land with its patient, perpetual argument. Inside the house, the clock ticked, and the stove gave its warmth without being asked, and the two people at the table continued their careful negotiation in the language they had both been speaking long before they met, the language of things said and things withheld, of presence and its particular, complicated weight. 67 days. The number sat between them, and neither of them mentioned it again, and outside the wind kept moving across that vast and patient land, carrying nothing with it but the smell of grass and the memory of rain and the suggestion, faint, persistent, that this place had been here long before any of them arrived, and would be here long after all the counting was done. The morning she stopped marking the doorframe, she did not notice she had stopped. That was the thing about it. There was no decision, no moment of resolve, no small ceremony of putting the penknife away and choosing differently. She simply came downstairs one morning with the full intention of making the mark, and then became occupied with the coffee and the bread and the particular quality of the light coming through the kitchen window, and the mark did not get made. and the day continued without it. She only realized it 3 days later, standing in her doorway in the early evening with her hand on the frame, running her fingers along the wood until she found the last line she had cut. She counted the marks. She counted the days. There was a gap of 3 she could not account for. She stood there for a moment, her fingers resting on the wood. Then she went downstairs to start supper, and she did not take the penknife with her. The children came because of Dorothy Holt, which was fitting, because most things in that part of the world seemed to come through Dorothy Holt one way or another. Dorothy mentioned, in the offhand way she mentioned things that were not offhand at all, that the nearest town was too far for the youngest children of 2 neighboring families to make the journey to school, and that they had not had consistent lessons in going on 2 seasons, and that it was a shame, really, in a land where reading was the difference between being cheated and not being cheated. Wren heard this and said nothing. She said nothing for 4 days. On the 5th day, she went to the barn where Cormac was repairing one of the wagon wheels, and she stood in the doorway until he looked up. "The old storage room on the east side of the barn," she said. "The one with the south-facing window. Is there anything in it you need?" He looked at her for a moment. "Not particularly. I'd like to use it in the mornings," she said, "for a few hours, if that's agreeable." He considered this in the way he considered most things, not slowly, but thoroughly. "For what?" "For teaching," she said. "There are children nearby who aren't getting lessons. I'd like to remedy that." He looked back at the wheel. He turned it once, checking the newly fitted spoke. "The window latch sticks," he said. "I'll fix it before morning." She went back to the house. The next morning, the window latch was fixed, and there was also a new shelf along the south wall that had not been there before. Plain pine boards, well fitted, sturdy enough to hold books. There was no note of explanation. There was no request for acknowledgement. The shelf was simply there, the way the coffee was always there, the way the harness had been repaired without discussion. Wren stood in the small room for a long moment, running her hand along the new wood. Then she went to get the primer and the 2 arithmetic texts she had brought in her valise, thinking she might need them for herself, never quite believing she would find an occasion to use them for their actual purpose. She arranged them on the shelf. She found an old piece of plank suitable for writing on and propped it against the wall. She set 2 crates in front of it that would serve as seats until something better could be arranged. She stood back and looked at what she had made. It was not a schoolroom, but it had the bones of one. 4 children came the first morning. They arrived with their older siblings, who delivered them with the particular combination of hope and skepticism that parents in difficult circumstances had always worn when handing their children to a teacher. Willing to believe, not quite willing to trust. Wren taught the way she had always taught, practically, without condescension, with the understanding that a child's attention is a gift and not an entitlement, and must be earned through the quality of what you offer it. She started where they were, and not where she wished they were. She asked what they already knew before she showed them what they didn't. She made no performance of her patience, because her patience was not a performance. By the end of the first morning, the youngest, a girl of perhaps 5 who had been delivered with the solemn expression of someone reporting for an obligation she had not requested, was sounding out 3-letter words with the focused intensity of a person discovering they are better at something than they expected. Wren felt something shift in her chest that she recognized. It was the feeling of being useful in the way she was actually built to be useful, which was different from being useful in the way circumstances required, and she had not felt it in long enough that it came as something close to surprise. She did not examine it closely. She went back to the lesson. Cormac came to the doorway of the storage room that afternoon. He did not come in. He stood in the frame with his hat in his hand and looked at the 4 children working through their letters on scraps of paper, and at Wren moving between them with the unhurried focus of someone entirely in her element. And his face was the face of a man looking at something he had not expected. She saw him there from across the room. She did not stop what she was doing. She simply acknowledged him with a slight turn of her head. "I see you. You don't have to go. You don't have to stay." And went back to the child beside her, who was frowning at the letter G, as if it had personally wronged him. Cormac stood there for perhaps 5 minutes. Then he put his hat back on and went back to his work. The following morning, when Wren went to the storage room to prepare for the day's lessons, there were 2 proper chairs beside the crates, child-sized, made of the same plain pine as the shelf, fitted together with the clean joinery of someone who knew what they were doing. She did not ask when he had made them. She could see from the wood shavings still caught in the corner that it had been recent. She swept the shavings up and set the chairs in place, and let that be sufficient. Dorothy Holt, when she heard about the chairs, said nothing. But the look she gave Wren over her coffee cup that morning said rather more than nothing, and Wren looked back at her with the composed expression of a woman declining to have a conversation. The children came every morning now with the reliability of something that has become part of a place's rhythm. There were 4 of them by the 3rd week, then 5 when a boy named Asa arrived escorted by his grandmother, who explained that he had a tendency towards stubbornness and a fear of letters that she believed were related. Wren had encountered stubbornness before. She understood that a fear of letters in children was rarely about the letters themselves. It was about the exposure, the particular vulnerability of being seen to not know something in front of people whose opinions mattered. She arranged the morning so that Asa never had to not know something in front of the others. She worked with him at the edge of the lesson, slightly apart, as if she had simply wandered over to talk about something else, and the letters had come up incidentally. By the end of the 2nd week, Asa was reading 3-letter words with a focus that he did not yet know was pride, because it had not yet occurred to him that he was doing anything remarkable. Wren noticed. She said nothing to him about it. She simply moved on to 4-letter words. The grandmother came to collect him one afternoon and stood at the doorway of the storage room for a moment, watching. Wren saw her there and noted the expression on the woman's face, the particular combination of relief and gratitude that she had learned, over years of teaching, to recognize and not draw attention to, because drawing attention to it made it harder to bear. Later, the grandmother pressed a small jar of something into Wren's hands without speaking, preserved fruit, dark and sweet-smelling. Wren accepted it with a nod because the exchange was one that did not need words and would not be improved by them. She put the jar on the kitchen windowsill where the light would come through it in the mornings. Cormac noticed it there and did not ask. But that evening he tried the preserved fruit on his bread and said, "This is good," in the tone of a man making an observation rather than a compliment, which was the highest form of praise he generally offered food. "A grandmother brought it," Wren said, "for teaching the boy." "Yes?" He nodded, ate another piece of bread, said nothing further. But when she went to take the jar from the windowsill the following week, she found he had moved it to the center of the sill, where the light would come through it best. The evening of the fire in the eastern field was the evening everything beneath the surface came closer to it. It had been a dry stretch, the grass shorter than usual from a season with less rain than the land preferred. Someone's cook fire at the neighboring property had jumped its ring and moved fast in the wind before anyone understood what was happening. By the time Cormac saw the smoke, It was already a line of orange moving through the grass toward the fence line. There was no time for deliberation. There was only movement. Cormac calling to the 2 ranch hands who came 3 days a week, all of them running for the tools, all of them moving toward the fire instead of away from it, because that was what you did out here, because there was no one else, and the alternative was worse. Wren did not go inside. She wet sacks at the water trough and dragged them to the edge of the fire's path and worked alongside the men for 2 hours in the smoke and heat, beating back the leading edge, helping contain what they could contain. She did not ask whether she should. She looked at what needed doing and did it, the way she had always looked at what needed doing and done it, without waiting for permission that no one had the time to grant. The fire was stopped eventually, not beaten exactly, more like persuaded to run out of fuel and momentum along the stretch they had worked. The damage was real, but manageable. The fence line would need work. The eastern pasture would take a season to recover. When it was over, they stood in the ruined grass in the particular quiet that follows an emergency. The quiet of people who have been moving at the edge of themselves and are now arriving back at ordinary time, which feels strange and slow by comparison. Cormac looked at her across the scorched ground. She was smoke-darkened and wind-blown, her hands red from the work, her dress beyond any reasonable salvage. She looked back at him with eyes that were clear and steady and entirely present, because crisis had always had the effect of simplifying her, burning away everything that was not essential and leaving only the part that knew what to do. "Come inside," he said, which was the most he seemed able to manage. She came inside. They sat at the kitchen table afterward, both of them still wearing the evidence of the evening, too tired for the usual careful arrangement of themselves. Dorothy had appeared from somewhere in the way she often did, assessed the situation in about 4 seconds, put water on to heat, and left a pot of something on the stove before departing with the efficiency of a person who had learned that sometimes help means doing the thing and leaving before anyone can make it complicated. Wren wrapped both hands around a cup she did not remember picking up. The heat of it worked into her palms, into the places that still registered the effort of the evening. Cormac sat across from her. He looked at the table, then at his own hands, then up at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it needed doing." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have been hurt. So could you." He looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with moments when he was deciding how far to go with something. "That's different, is it?" It was not quite a question. The quiet held between them, but it was a different quality of quiet than the ones they had built over the previous weeks. Those had been careful, managed, constructed. This one was simply what was left when everything unnecessary had been removed. She looked at the cup in her hands. "My husband died in an accident," she said. "I've lived with the understanding since then that there are days when things go wrong, and there is nothing you can do about it, and days when things go wrong, and there is something you can do, and the job is to know which day you're on." Cormac was very still. "Tonight was the second kind," she said. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said quietly, "What was he like?" It was not quite a question either, more like an opening. She considered it. Not the question of what to say, but the question of where to start, which was different. "Steady," she said finally. He was the kind of man who did what he said he would do. No more, but never less. That's rarer than people think. "It is," Cormac said. Something in the way he said it made her look up. He was looking at the far wall, at nothing in particular. Margaret used to say the same thing about reliability, that it was underrated, that people looked for the wrong things. He paused. She was right about most things. What was she like? Wren asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was level, but level in the way of a thing that has been made level through considerable effort. She laughed at things I didn't expect, he said. I'd say something I meant as ordinary and she'd find it funny, and I'd realize afterward that it was, that I'd said something without knowing it was worth saying. He stopped. He turned the cup in his hands. I don't know how she did that. I was never quick enough to catch it before she was already laughing. Wren looked at him. He was still looking at the wall, but she saw it. The thing beneath the level surface, the shape of an absence he had been carrying for 3 years. In the careful, compressed way, he carried everything. I had a student, she said, after Thomas died. He looked at her. She told him about the boy. Not the accident. Not yet. Perhaps not tonight. But the child himself. The lost boot. The way he mispronounced particularly for an entire school year, and she could not correct him because the mispronunciation was so perfectly his. The way he had once drawn a picture of the schoolroom from memory that was completely wrong in every proportion and somehow exactly right in every way that mattered. She told him about the book in her drawer, the primer with the name on the inside cover. She told him she didn't know why she had brought it. She told him she hadn't been able to leave it behind. I think, Cormac said slowly, that sometimes the things we carry are the things that remind us of who we still intend to be. She looked at him. He seemed slightly surprised by his own sentence. He went back to his cup. But the sentence was already in the room, already real, and neither of them could pretend it wasn't. The next morning, she took the primer out of the drawer. She set it on the table beside the window in her room, where the morning light came in clearest. She opened the cover and looked at the name on the first page. The large, uneven letters of a child learning to form his own identity in handwriting. She looked at it for a long time. Then she carried it downstairs and placed it on the shelf in the storage room, between the arithmetic text and the primer she had been using with the children. She turned it so the spine faced out, the way a book belongs on a shelf. The name was hidden inside the cover now, private and kept, but the book itself was out in the light. She went to start the morning lesson. When the children arrived, the youngest girl went directly to the shelf and ran her fingers along the spines of the books with the proprietary air of a person who has decided that a good thing belongs to everyone. She pulled out the small primer and brought it to Wren with the unself-conscious confidence of a 5-year-old presenting a gift. "This one," the girl said. Wren took it from her. She looked at the worn cover, the soft edges from years of small hands. "This one," she agreed and opened it to the first page. Edmund's second letter arrived on a morning when the light was particularly good, and Wren had been almost content, which was perhaps why its timing felt like a deliberate insult. She recognized the handwriting before she recognized anything else, and the recognition moved through her like something cold and unwelcome. She opened it standing at the door, not yet inside. Edmund had been doing his calculations. He wrote that he had heard, from a source he did not name, that the arrangement appeared to be proceeding well, that both parties seemed to be settling in a manner that might suggest permanence, and that this was wonderful news, truly wonderful, and he hoped she would be very happy, and that naturally, if things moved in that direction, it would be appropriate to revisit certain considerations that they had not had occasion to finalize, and he trusted she understood his meaning, and he was, as always, her loving brother Edmund. She read it twice. She did not burn it this time. She folded it and put it in her pocket because she wanted to feel the weight of it there, wanted to know exactly where it was and what it was, wanted to be very clear with herself about who Edmund was and what he was willing to do. She walked to the barn. Cormac was inside, doing the morning work, his back to the door. "My brother," she said, "is using this arrangement to position himself for something. I don't know exactly what, but I want you to know that if anyone approaches you on his behalf or in connection with him, you should say nothing and agree to nothing and send them to me." Cormac turned around slowly. He looked at her face. He looked at the letter-shaped pressure in the pocket of her dress, which she had not meant to make visible, but apparently had. "All right," he said. "He's not dangerous," she said. "He's just—" She stopped. She tried again. "He's the kind of person who turns everything into a transaction. Every relationship, every circumstance. He can't help it. He's been doing it since we were children." She paused. "I came here partly because of him. That's something you should probably understand." Cormac was very quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You know, a man came from town about 3 weeks after you arrived. He said it simply, without accusation. He was asking about the land arrangement and whether I'd considered adding a secondary party to certain documents. He mentioned your brother by name." Wren stood very still. "I told him there was nothing to discuss," Cormac said, "and that was the end of it." She absorbed this. She absorbed the fact that he had known, or suspected, for weeks, and had not said anything, and had not looked at her differently, and had continued to leave coffee in the pot every morning. "You didn't tell me," she said. "You didn't ask." He said it without reproach. "And it was handled." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze without flinching, which was what he always did, because he was the kind of man who did not look away from things that warranted being looked at directly. "Thank you," she said. "It's handled," he said again. She left the barn. She walked back to the house across the yard in the clear morning light, and she put Edmund's letter in the stove, and she watched it burn, and this time she did not feel the cold weight of it afterward. She felt instead something that had the shape of resolve, not the kind she had been carrying since she arrived, the resolve of a woman keeping count, but a different kind, quieter, less about direction and more about ground. The kind of resolve that comes from deciding, not to go anywhere in particular, but simply to stand on something real. She stood at the kitchen window for a while afterward, looking out at the yard, at the barn, at the land beyond it, at Cormac moving between the outbuildings with the unhurried purpose that was so particular to him, the walk of a man who knew every foot of this ground and was not in any hurry to be anywhere that was not here. She had been watching him move through this space for long enough now that she had catalogued its qualities without meaning to. The way he always latched the barn door twice, once quickly and once with deliberate checking. The way he talked to the animals in a low, continuous murmur that was not quite conversation, but was not nothing either. The way he always stopped at the fence at the east end of the property and looked out over the pasture for a moment before turning back, as if confirming that the land was still doing what land was supposed to do. She thought about what it would mean to know a piece of ground that well. To have a fence line that was yours, a field that had been yours through drought and abundance, a barn that you had repaired so many times that every board of it was familiar in the particular way that things become familiar when you have put your hands on them in need. She turned from the window and started the bread. She had been making bread every few days since she arrived, not because anyone asked, but because the house needed it. and because the work of it was satisfying in the way of work that is entirely physical and produces something you can hold. The kneading especially. There was something in the resistance of the dough, in the way it pushed back and then yielded and then pushed back again, that she found useful for the mind. It was impossible to knead bread and also worry about the future. The dough required everything you had. She was working through the second kneading when Cormac came in from the yard. He stopped in the doorway the way he sometimes did, not quite entering, just marking his arrival, giving her the room to acknowledge him in her own time. She had come to understand that this was not hesitation. It was courtesy of the particular kind that people with a strong sense of space extended to others. "Bread," he said, which was not quite a question. "In an hour," she said. He nodded and went to wash at the basin. She went back to the kneading. The kitchen was warm and smelled of yeast and the particular dusty sweetness of flour, and outside the land went on being the land, and that was, she had found, enough. That evening, Cormac came into the kitchen while she was at the stove and set something on the table without comment. She turned. It was a small branch, dried now, with 2 or 3 small white flowers still clinging to it. The kind that grew along the creek bed to the east, delicate and without apparent purpose. The sort of thing that bloomed because it was the nature of the thing to bloom, and not for any other reason. She looked at it. She looked at him. He was already getting a cup from the shelf, his back to her, the set of his shoulders in the particular arrangement she had come to understand as a man doing something he has done quickly, before he could think too carefully about it. They were at the edge of the eastern pasture, he said, not turning around. Near where the fire came through. Most of them are gone. He poured his coffee. Those held. She looked at the branch on the table. She looked at the small white flowers that had held against the edge of the fire, that were here now in her kitchen on an ordinary evening. She did not say anything. He sat down with his coffee and opened his book. She turned back to the stove, and the kitchen held its warmth. And outside the land lay quiet under the beginning of the dark, and the branch with its small white flowers sat on the table between them like a sentence that did not need finishing. Later, when she went upstairs, she set the branch on the windowsill of her room, where the morning light would find it first. She did not mark the doorframe. She stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the dark land and the extraordinary stars, and she thought about what Cormac had said, that sometimes the things we carry are the things that remind us of who we still intend to be. And she thought about the book on the shelf downstairs with the child's name inside the cover, out in the light now, where it belonged. She thought about the difference between a plan and a life, and whether there was a point at which one became the other without you noticing, the way she had stopped marking the doorframe without noticing, the way she had started waking up and thinking about the morning's lesson before she thought about the days remaining. She stood there until the cold of the window glass found her through her sleeve. Then she went to bed, and she did not lie awake keeping count, and outside the land held its quiet in both hands like something precious, and the stars turned, and somewhere below her, the house breathed in the particular rhythm of a place that has been waiting, patiently and without urgency, for the people inside it to catch up to what it already knew. The horse died on a Tuesday. Wren had begun to notice days differently by then, not marking them down the way she had in the beginning, but inhabiting them the way you inhabit a room you have decided is yours. Tuesday was the day the light came in at a low angle in the mornings this time of season, long and honey-colored, lying across the kitchen floor in strips that moved slowly as the sun rose. She was watching the light move when she heard Cormac cross the yard to the barn, which was his habit, earlier than early, before the day had fully committed to being a day. She heard the barn door. She heard nothing after that for long enough that it registered as wrong. Because there was always something after the barn door, the sound of movement, of feeding, of the ordinary industry of a man beginning his work. The quiet lasted. She set down her cup. She was halfway across the yard when Cormac came out of the barn. He closed the door behind him with the careful, deliberate motion of a man making sure a thing was properly shut. He stood with his hand on the wood for a moment, his back to her, his head slightly bowed. She stopped walking. He did not turn around immediately. When he did, his face was arranged in the expression she had come to recognize as his default in difficult moments. Composed, present, giving nothing away on the surface. But she had been watching his face for long enough now to see beneath the surface, and what she saw there was the particular stillness of someone absorbing a blow they had been expecting for some time and had not been able to prepare for regardless. Copper, he said. That was the horse's name, the old bay gelding, the one that had been on this land longer than any other living thing on it, the one that had belonged to the years before she arrived. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. She did not say she was sorry. She had learned over years of sitting with grieving people that the word, however sincerely meant, had a way of arriving like a door closing, final, summarizing, suggesting that the feeling could be packaged and set aside. Instead, she walked the rest of the way across the yard and stood beside him, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and she looked at the barn door with him and said nothing at all. He stood there for a long moment. Then his hand, which had been at his side, moved toward hers. Not a grasp, more like a question asked at the level of the fingers, tentative and brief. The back of his hand against the back of hers in the space between them. She turned her hand over. He pressed his palm against hers once, and then released it, and then stepped back from the barn door and went to do the rest of the morning's work in the way he always did, which was to say, without ceremony, without complaint, putting one foot in front of the other because the land did not pause for grief, and he had never expected it to. She watched him go. She stood in the yard for a moment longer, her hand at her side where his had been, and then she went inside to make breakfast, which would be on the table when he came in, which was the only form of comfort she knew how to offer that she was certain he would accept. Dorothy came that afternoon without being summoned, which was how Dorothy always came. She brought nothing this time. No pie, no provisions. Just herself, which was in its own way more than enough. She sat at the kitchen table while Wren made tea and said, "He raised that horse from a foal. Margaret loved it. After she was gone, he kept it the way some men keep." She paused, searching for the word. The way some men keep things that hold the shape of what they've lost. Wren set the cups on the table. "He'll be quiet tonight," Dorothy said. "More quiet than usual, which is saying something. Don't let him be too alone with it." "I don't know if that's my place," Wren said. Dorothy looked at her over the rim of her cup with the expression of a woman who has long since lost patience with a particular category of foolishness. Whose place would it be, then? Wren did not have an answer for that. Dorothy drank her tea and left, and the afternoon moved through its paces, and the children came and had their lesson and went home, and the sun made its long, slow argument toward the horizon, and Wren made supper and set it on the table and waited. Cormac came in later than usual. He washed at the basin and sat down and ate, and the manner of the quiet that night was the old kind, weighted, managed, held at a careful distance from anything real. She let it sit through most of the meal. Then she said, without looking up from her plate, "Tell me about him. Copper. What he was like." Cormac looked at her. "The beginning," she said, "when you first got him." He was quiet long enough that she thought she had miscalculated. Then he set his fork down and looked at the table, and he talked. Haltingly at first, the words coming the way water comes through ground that has been dry a long time. Slow, uncertain of the path, finding the way by feel. He talked about the foal, knock-kneed and suspicious, wanting nothing to do with human hands in the beginning. About the particular patience required to earn a young horse's trust, which was different from the patience required for most other things because it had to be entirely without agenda. The animal knew immediately if you wanted something from it, and the only approach that worked was to want nothing, to simply be present until presence became ordinary and ordinary became safe. He talked about Margaret watching from the fence that first year, her chin in her hand, telling him he was going to be out there until the snow came. She had been right. He had been. The snow had come, and he had still been working with the horse, patient and agendaless, while she stood at the fence in her coat, with her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "She brought me coffee out there," he said, "every afternoon, without being asked." He stopped. He looked at the table. "I never told her how much that meant. I meant to. There were a lot of things I meant to." The kitchen was very quiet. "I think she knew," Wren said. He looked up. "The kind of person who brings coffee out to a cold field every afternoon without being asked," she said, "is the kind of person who pays attention. She would have known." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not breaking, not releasing, but adjusting. The way a long-held tension adjusts when the reason for holding it has been gently addressed. "Maybe," he said. He picked up his fork again. They finished the meal in a quiet that was different from the one they had started it in. More settled, the kind that didn't need managing because it wasn't containing anything that wanted to get out. She was sitting at the kitchen table 3 mornings later, working through the arithmetic problems she had prepared for the children, when she heard him on the stairs. He paused in the kitchen doorway. She looked up. He was holding a piece of paper, folded, and his face had the particular expression of a man who has seen something he hadn't expected and hasn't decided yet what to do about it. He set the paper on the table in front of her. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. Then she looked at the paper again. It was the letter she had half written, the inquiry about a teaching position in a town 2 days' ride east, the one she had drafted on a quiet afternoon and left unfinished on the desk in the sitting room. She had not thought about it in over a week. She had not sent it. "The window was open," he said. "The wind moved it to the floor. I picked it up before I understood what it was." He said this with the careful evenness of a man accounting for his actions without being asked, because he wanted the record to be clear. "I didn't read past the first line." She looked at the letter. The first line was, "I am writing to inquire whether there may be a position available for an experienced teacher of primary students, as I will be seeking placement in the coming weeks." The coming weeks. She had written that when the coming weeks had seemed like a clear and obvious horizon. She could not now remember precisely what morning it had been. "The agreement ends in 8 days, he said. "I know," she said. "I know you know." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down in it, which was unusual. He was a man who sat at tables for meals and stood for everything else. Sitting meant he intended to stay in this conversation. I want to ask you something. She set down her pencil. And I want you to answer it honestly, he said, even if you think the honest answer is not what I want to hear. Because I've had enough of things left unsaid to last me the rest of my life, and I'd rather know than not know. She looked at his face. He was watching her with the directness that was so particular to him, the kind of attention that neither demanded anything nor deflected anything, that simply received. All right, she said. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the table. Did you come here intending to leave at the end of the agreement? She held his gaze. Yes. And now? She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because the answer deserved to be said correctly, and she wanted to find the right words for it. Now I don't know, she said. And I'm not sure what to do with not knowing. I've spent a long time understanding what I was doing and why I was doing it. Not knowing feels... She stopped. It feels like standing at the edge of something I can't see the bottom of. He was quiet for a moment. That's fair. I'm not finished, she said. He waited. I came here because Edmund signed my name on a contract without my knowledge. That's the truth, and I don't want to dress it up. I came because I didn't have another good option, and because I couldn't let him face the consequences of his own decisions, which is something I've been doing since we were children, and something I'm trying to stop doing. She paused. I plan to fulfill the contract in good faith, exercise the dissolution clause, and leave with my dignity intact and no debt to anyone. That was the plan. And the plan changed, he said. It was not quite a question. The plan encountered this place, she said, and the children in the storage room, and Dorothy, and... She stopped again. She looked at the table, then back at him. And the fact that you leave coffee in the pot every morning without being asked, and that you built a shelf before I'd told anyone what I needed it for, and that you picked up that letter without reading past the first line, and then came and put it in front of me, instead of simply pretending you hadn't seen it. He was very still. I'm telling you the truth, she said. All of it. Because you asked for it, and because I think you deserve it, and because I'm tired of arranging things carefully to protect everyone's feelings, including my own. A long moment passed. The clock ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the yard in its ordinary way, indifferent and constant. I signed the contract for the land, he said. That's the truth of my end of it. The regulation, the review, the holding rights. I needed the document, and I needed someone willing to sign it, and this was the arrangement that was possible. He looked at the table. I didn't think past that. I didn't want to think past it. He paused. And then you arrived, and you reorganized the pantry on the third day without asking. And you talked a frightened horse into standing still. And you read philosophy out loud in the kitchen on a rainy afternoon, and... He stopped. He pressed his lips together briefly. And I started leaving more coffee in the pot than I needed for myself, and I stopped noticing I was doing it. The kitchen was so quiet she could hear the fire in the stove. What are you saying? She asked very carefully. He looked at her. His face was the most open she had ever seen it. Not vulnerable exactly, not broken, but unguarded in the way of someone who has decided that guarding is no longer worth the cost. I'm saying, he said slowly, that I'm going to ask you something, and I don't want you to answer it based on the contract or the land or Edmund or what you planned when you came here. I want you to answer it based on what you actually want. Which I understand may be a difficult question because I'm not certain anyone has asked you that in quite some time. She felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for. Something that had been folded up very small for a very long time, making itself known. I'm asking, he said, whether you want to stay. She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man who had made her a shelf without explaining, who had sat beside her in a quiet that asked nothing of her, who had told her about a horse and a wife and a cup of coffee in a cold field, and all the things he had meant to say and hadn't. This man who had picked up her letter and brought it to her intact, unread, the boundary of her privacy more important to him than his own wanting to know. She thought about the marks on the door frame that she had stopped making without noticing. She thought about the children in the storage room and the book on the shelf with the child's name inside. She thought about the branch with white flowers on her windowsill that had held against the edge of the fire. She thought about intending, about the difference between a plan you make before you know anything and a choice you make after you know everything. She opened her mouth. And then Edmund walked through the front door. He did not knock. Edmund had never believed in knocking, which was consistent with his general view that the spaces other people occupied were open to him by right of relation. He came through the front door and into the kitchen with the particular confidence of a man who has told himself a story in which he is welcome. And he stopped when he saw both of them at the table, and his eyes moved between them with the rapid calculation of someone reading a room for what it contained. "Wren," he said, with the warmth of a man who has practiced warmth until it no longer resembles the original. I was in the area. No one who had ever been in this part of the world would have been in this area accidentally. There was nothing here that was on the way to somewhere else. Wren stood up. She did not move toward him. "Edmund." He looked at Cormac with the extended hand of social reflex. "You must be vain. Edmund Ashby, Wren's brother." He said this as if the relation were a credential. Cormac stood. He shook the hand without warmth and without hostility, with the flat courtesy of a man who has already heard enough about this particular visitor to have no expectations that need adjusting. "I'll put my horse up," Edmund said, "and then perhaps we can all sit down together. I have some things I'd like to discuss." "No," Wren said. Edmund looked at her. "You'll come with me," she said. "Outside, now." She walked past him through the front door without waiting. They stood in the yard, far enough from the house that the walls would hold the conversation. The late afternoon light lay long across the ground between them. Edmund looked at the house, at the barn, at the general landscape of the situation, which she could see him assessing with the practiced eye of a man who arrived at everything late and tried to catch up by reading surfaces. "You look well," he said. "Better than I expected, honestly." "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "I know why you're here," she said. "You've decided the arrangement is going to become permanent, and you want to position yourself to benefit from it before it's finalized. You want a conversation with Cormac about documents, about rights, about something you've constructed in your head that sounds reasonable and equitable and is neither." Edmund had the grace, at least, to recognize that denial would cost more than it gained. "I only want to make sure your interests are protected, Wren. Family looks out for family. You signed my name on a contract," she said, "without my knowledge, while I was ill. I did what was necessary." "You did what was convenient for you," she said. "And then you told yourself a story about how it was for my benefit, because you've always been very good at that. At finding the version of events in which what you wanted and what I needed happened to be the same thing." She looked at him steadily. They've never been the same thing, Edmund. I've just never said so clearly. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that she rarely saw there. Something that might have been, if he had more practice at it, actual feeling. You're going to stay, he said. It was not quite an accusation, not quite a question. I can see it from here. That's not your business, she said. What happens here, what I decide, what I build or don't build, none of it is your business anymore. You made it your business once without asking. You don't get to do that again. Wren. I'm not angry, she said, which was true and which surprised her. I spent a long time being angry. I don't have room for it anymore. She looked at her brother, this man she had loved helplessly and without illusion since she was a child, this man who had cost her so much by meaning well in the approximate way of people who confuse intention with effort. I hope you find your way to something real, Edmund. I mean that. But you're going to do it somewhere else. He looked at her for a long moment. The Edmund she had known her whole life would have argued, would have found the angle, the approach, the version of the conversation in which he came out ahead. This Edmund, standing in the fading afternoon light of a yard that had nothing to do with him, looked at his sister and seemed, for the first time in her memory, to understand that something was genuinely finished. All right, he said quietly. He went and got his horse from where he had tied it. She stood in the yard and watched him ride out, and she did not feel the cold weight of it the way she had felt the burning letters. She felt instead the particular lightness of a thing genuinely released, not cut, not broken, but properly set down in the place it had always needed to be set, with both hands and clear eyes. She stood in the yard for a while after he was gone, long enough for the light to change, for the evening to begin making itself known in the dropping temperature and the way the shadows lengthened across the ground. Then she turned and went back into the house. Cormac was at the stove, doing something practical and unhurried, which was what he always did when he was waiting. He had given her the yard, the conversation, the distance required to handle her own business in her own way. He had not watched from the window. She knew this without checking. She came to stand beside him, not across the room, beside him at the stove, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it and the warmth of him adjacent to it. He did not look at her right away. He finished what he was doing. Then he set the spoon down and turned to face her. You were saying something, he said. Before. I was, she said. The kitchen held its breath. You asked me whether I wanted to stay, she said. And I want to answer that correctly. Not from the contract and not from Edmund and not from what I planned when I arrived, which you already asked for and which I've already agreed to. She looked at him. I want to stay because this is the first place I have ever chosen for myself. Because of the shelf you built before I asked, and the chairs you made for the children, and the fact that you sat beside that barn door for an hour with a horse you couldn't save before you came out and told me, because you needed that hour and you knew it. She stopped. Because you are the kind of man who knows what he needs, and takes it without apology and without excess. And I have been looking for a model of that my whole life without knowing what I was looking for. He was very still. That is why I want to stay, she said. Not the land, not the contract, not any version of obligation. That is the honest answer to your honest question. The quiet between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had been said and the few things that still needed to be, which could wait, which were not urgent, which would find their own time in the ordinary course of days that were beginning to look, from this particular moment, like they belonged to both of them. Cormac reached out and took her hand. Not the tentative, almost question of the barnyard that morning with Copper. A full, deliberate, clear-eyed holding of her hand in his thumb moving once across her knuckles, the way a person touches something real to confirm that it is. "Then stay," he said. Outside, the evening came down across the land in its slow, unargued way, and the stars began their appearance one by one, and the house held them both in its patient walls, and the wind moved through the grass as it had always moved, as it would always move, carrying nothing but itself, and the faint suggestion that this place had known, all along, how this was going to go. The morning after was ordinary in every way that mattered. Cormac rose before the light changed. The front door closed with its familiar, careful sound. The coffee was made. When Wren came downstairs, the pot was full, as it had always been, as it would continue to be. But she stood in the kitchen with her cup and understood the gesture differently now, not as habit, not as courtesy alone, as a daily small declaration made in the only language he had ever been fully comfortable speaking, and one she had finally learned to receive. She drank her coffee in the quiet and watched the light come in through the window and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the absence of arithmetic. No days to count, no terms to calculate, no plan laid out in careful rows that she was moving through one mark at a time. Just the morning and the light and the land outside doing what it always did, which was to say, continuing, in its vast and patient way, without asking anything of the people who lived on it except that they show up. She showed up. She wrote to Edmund that week. Not a long letter. She had never been a woman who used more words than a thing required. She wrote that she hoped he was well. She wrote that she intended to remain where she was, that this was her decision made freely and in full possession of her circumstances, and that the terms of the original agreement were concluded as written with no outstanding obligations on any side. She wrote that she was not angry, which was still true, which continued to surprise her in a quiet way. She wrote that she hoped he would find, eventually, something he had not arranged in advance, something that arrived sideways, the way real things arrived, without warning and without a clause for dissolution. She did not know if he would understand what she meant by that. She sent the letter anyway. The shelf in the storage room grew. A second row of books appeared on it, then a third, texts contributed by Dorothy, who turned out to have accumulated a significant library over her years in the territory and who claimed she had no room for them, which was not entirely true, but was the kind of not entirely true thing that people said when they wanted to give a gift without the weight of it being called a gift. 2 more children joined the morning lessons, arriving the first time with the formal uncertainty of children entering a new social system, departing by the end of the week with the proprietary ease of children who have decided they belong somewhere. The storage room had a proper door now. Cormac had rehung it over a weekend, adjusting the frame, fitting new iron hardware that worked smoothly. He did not mention that he had done this. Wren did not mention that she noticed. They had long since stopped needing to narrate the things they did for each other, which was its own kind of fluency. The small primer remained on the shelf, spine out, between the arithmetic text and the newer reader Dorothy had contributed. Wren had written a small card for it, the boy's name, the brief span of his life, a single line underneath. He was a good student who lost his boot more often than anyone thought possible. The card was tucked inside the front cover, private and kept, but the book itself was out in the light. She had not stopped thinking about him. She did not think she ever would. But the thinking had changed in character, less like a wound being pressed and more like a scar being traced, something that was part of her now, something that had its shape and its meaning and did not demand to be anything other than what it was. Dorothy came on a bright morning about 3 weeks after Edmund's visit and sat at the kitchen table in her usual way, helping herself to coffee and looking at Wren with the sharp, contented expression of a woman who has been right about something and is allowing herself the private pleasure of it without gloating. Mostly. "You look different," Dorothy said. "Do I?" said Wren. "Less like someone waiting for the next coach." Dorothy turned her cup in her hands. "More like someone who lives here." Wren sat down across from her. "I do live here." Dorothy smiled. Not the small, measuring smile she used for observation, but a full one, genuine. The smile of a woman who had sat across from enough tables in enough difficult kitchens to know the difference between a person who had arrived and a person who was still looking for somewhere to land. "Good," said Dorothy. She drank her coffee. He needed someone who would stay because she wanted to, not because she was supposed to. Wren looked at her. He would say he didn't need anyone. He would, Dorothy agreed. Men like him always do. It's part of the condition. She set her cup down. Doesn't make it less true. They sat together for a while, and then Dorothy said something she had not said before, said it in the offhand way she said the things that mattered most. "Margaret would have liked you." Wren looked at her. "I mean it," Dorothy said. "She would have seen what you are right away. She was quick that way, quicker than him." A pause. "Than most people." "I would have liked her," Wren said. Dorothy nodded once, as if that settled something that had been open between them. Then she finished her coffee and stood and pulled on her coat. And at the door, she paused the way she sometimes did, not from uncertainty, but from the desire to say one true thing before leaving. "He didn't used to talk much," Dorothy said, not turning around. "Before. Barely at all." She drew it out of him. Not by asking, just by being the kind of person it made sense to talk to. A beat. "I haven't heard him talk the way he talks now in 3 years." She left without waiting for an answer, which was, as always, entirely characteristic. Wren sat at the table for a while after Dorothy left, her hands around a cup that had gone cold, watching through the kitchen window as Cormac moved across the yard with the unhurried purpose that was so particular to him. She thought about what Dorothy had said. She thought about Margaret, this woman she had never met and would never meet, who had brought coffee to a cold field and laughed at the right moments and known what she had. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person it makes sense to talk to. Outside, the land held its enormous quiet, and the grass moved in the wind, and Cormac stopped at the fence at the east end of the property and looked out over the pasture for a moment, as he always did, before turning back. She watched him turn. She watched him start back toward the barn. She felt at home, not the home of childhood, which is a place you are given, not the home of marriage, which is a place you build around someone else. Something older and more fundamental than either of those. The home of choosing. The home that only exists when you walk toward it with your eyes open and your hands free, and nothing pulling you but your own honest wanting. Spring came to the land the way it always came. Not all at once, but in increments, each day slightly warmer, slightly longer, the grass shifting from gold to green by degrees too small to track, and yet unmistakable in some. The eastern pasture that the fire had taken was greening again from the root up, the new growth coming in bright and insistent, the land reasserting itself without drama. Wren planted a garden on the south side of the house, not the small kitchen garden that had been there before, tended out of practical necessity, but a proper garden with room for things that served no purpose except to be beautiful. Wildflowers along the border, a climbing vine she had started from a cutting Dorothy had brought, herbs she had always wanted to grow but had never had a piece of ground to grow them in. Cormac watched her work in it in the evenings when the day's labor was done. He did not offer to help because he understood that the garden was hers in a way that some things are specifically a person's and needed to remain that way. But one morning, she found that the border stones had been reset. They had been slightly uneven, listing after a wet week had softened the ground, and she had meant to fix them and had not gotten to it. They were even now, set with the clean precision of someone who had paid attention to what was crooked and known how to make it right. She did not say anything about the stones. He did not say anything about the stones. This was, she had come to understand, its own form of conversation. The longest and most honest one they had, conducted over months in the language of small things done and noticed, and not made into more than they were. The language of two people learning to inhabit the same life without crowding each other out of it. One morning, some weeks into the spring, she came downstairs to find Cormac at the kitchen table with his guitar. Not in the barn, not in the particular solitude of the night. Here, in the kitchen, in the morning, with the coffee made and the light coming through the window in its ordinary way, and him sitting in the chair he always sat in, playing the same slow melody she had heard that very first night through the walls of the house. He looked up when she came in. He did not stop playing. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from him and opened the book she had been reading. And he kept playing. And the morning did its usual work around them, the light moving across the floor, the stove giving off its warmth, the land outside going about its business. At some point he played a wrong note. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression that she had come to think of as his most unguarded. Slightly caught, slightly amused, the expression of a man who has done something deliberately and is pretending he hasn't. She went back to her book. The corners of her mouth did not move, but her shoulders, just slightly, shook. He played another wrong note. She looked up again. He was looking at the ceiling with the elaborate innocence of a man who has never played a wrong note in his life and has no idea what she might be referring to. She set the book down. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that catches you before you have decided to laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine and bypasses everything careful on the way out. He looked at her when she laughed, and his face did something she had not quite seen it do before. It relaxed. Not the careful relaxation of a man who has decided to relax, but the involuntary kind. The kind that happens when a person encounters something that is exactly as good as they had hoped it would be. "You did that on purpose," she said. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Yes, you do." He went back to playing, this time correctly, a small smile that he probably did not know was there sitting at the corner of his mouth. Wren watched it for a moment. Then she picked up her book and went back to reading, and the morning continued around them, ordinary and sufficient, and theirs. On a quiet evening, when the light was going amber and the day had been long in the good way of days that are full without being heavy, they sat on the porch in the two chairs that had always been there. She had wondered sometimes who had placed them, whether there had always been two or whether one had been added, whether the second chair had been an act of hope or an act of habit. and she had never asked. Cormac was quiet in the particular way of someone who has something to say and is deciding how to say it, which was a quality she had learned to read in him the way she had learned to read weather, not from any single sign, but from an accumulation of small ones. She waited. "I have been thinking," he said, which was how he began most important things, stating the fact of thought before the thought itself, as if to give fair warning. "I know," she said. He looked at her sideways with the expression she had privately come to think of as his most unguarded one, slightly caught, slightly amused, the expression of a man discovering that someone has learned to read him and finding that he does not mind. "The land review," he said. "The next one. It will require documentation, a formal declaration of continued arrangement." He paused. "I want to be clear that I'm not asking because of the review." "I know," she said again. "The review is a fact," he said. "It exists. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't." He turned to look at her directly, which was always how he handled the things that mattered, not sideways, not at an angle, but straight on, with the full attention of a man who had learned the cost of looked-away moments. "But it's not the reason." She looked at him. The amber light lay across his face, across the weathered and particular angles of it, the face she had watched long enough to know by something deeper than sight. "What is the reason?" she asked, because she wanted to hear him say it, because she thought he needed to say it, because they had both spent too much time around people who left the important things inside where they decayed. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the new grass of the eastern pasture. A bird called from somewhere near the creek and was answered by another. The brief exchange of small voices in the large evening. "Because you stayed," he said. "Not because the contract said to. Not because you didn't have somewhere else to go. Because you looked at this place and this life and decided it was worth staying for." He turned the words over once more, ensuring they were the right ones. "I want to deserve that." She looked at him for a long moment. "You already do," she said. He took her hand on the arm of the chair, the full, deliberate, clear-eyed holding of it, his thumb moving across her knuckles the way it had in the kitchen, the confirmation of something real. They sat like that while the evening came down. No ceremony, no performance, just two people on a porch in the last light, the land spreading out before them in all its patient enormity, the stars beginning their slow appearance in the darkening sky. Months later, on a morning in early spring with the garden beginning to show the first green promises of the season, a woman came to the door. She was young, younger than Wren had been when she arrived, though she carried herself with the compressed posture of someone who had already been through enough to make her older in the ways that counted. She had a bag in one hand and a folded paper in the other, and the eyes of someone who had been told to come here by someone she trusted but was not yet sure the trust was warranted. Wren opened the door and saw all of this in the time it took to draw a breath. She had seen it before. She recognized it the way you recognize a landscape you have moved through yourself. Not with nostalgia, not with pity, but with the particular steadiness of someone who knows the terrain and knows it can be crossed. "I was told," the young woman began, "that there might be—" She stopped. She was carrying too many things at once. The bag and the paper and the explanation and the uncertainty and the hoping without wanting to hope, in case the hoping turned out to be wrong. Wren stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Leave the explaining for after. Tea first." The young woman stepped inside, and Wren closed the door behind her. And from across the yard, Cormac saw the closed door from where he was working, and understood, in the way he had come to understand most things about her, that something had arrived that she was handling, and that she would tell him about it in the evening on the porch, and that in the meantime, what was needed from him was exactly what he was already doing. He went back to his work. Inside, the kettle was on. The young woman sat at the kitchen table with the careful posture of someone who has not been sure in a while whether the chair they are sitting in is actually meant for them. Wren set the cups down and sat across from her. "You don't have to explain anything yet," she said, "and you don't have to decide anything today. You only have to be here." She folded her hands on the table. "That's enough to start with." The young woman looked at her. Something in the set of her face shifted, not breaking, not releasing, but adjusting, the way a long-held tension adjusts when someone has finally said the thing it needed to hear. Outside, the land lay open and enormous under the wide sky, unhurried and unchanged, holding its quiet as it always had. The wind moved through the grass. The garden along the south wall nodded its wildflowers in the afternoon light, bright and purposeless and entirely itself. That evening, after the young woman had eaten and been shown to the spare room, Wren told Cormac about her on the porch. She told it simply, the way she had learned to tell things that mattered, without ornamentation, letting the facts carry the weight they already had. A young woman, traveling alone, carrying a folded paper with an address on it. The eyes of someone who had been told to hope, but was not yet sure it was safe. Cormac listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened. "What does she need?" he said when Wren had finished. "Time," Wren said, "to figure out what comes next, and a place that isn't moving underneath her while she does it." He nodded. He looked out at the land in the way he looked at things he was making a decision about, thoroughly and from all angles, and without rushing the process. Then he said, "She can stay as long as she needs." Wren looked at him. "There's room," he said simply. There was always room, she had found, in a house where the people living in it had decided to make room. It was not about the walls or the roof or the number of doors. It was about the quality of the welcome offered, about the willingness to let someone else's life become part of the weave of the place without demanding that it match the existing pattern exactly. Cormac had been doing that for her since the beginning, she understood now. Since before she had understood what he was doing. The coffee left in the pot, the shelf built without being asked, the second chair on the porch that had always been there, as if it had always been waiting. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For having room," she said, then and now. He was quiet for a moment. The stars were doing their usual extraordinary thing overhead, thick and indifferent and ancient. "It's easier," he said finally, "when the person fits." She thought about that for a while, about fitting, about the way she had arrived here like something introduced into a space it was not designed for, and the way the space had gradually rearranged itself, or she had, or both, until the fit was real and had stopped being something either of them thought about. The wind moved through the grass below the porch. A night bird called from somewhere near the creek. "Go inside," he said after a while. "It's getting cold." "In a minute," she said. He did not argue. He did not go in himself. They sat for another few minutes in the cold and the dark, with the land spread out below them and the stars turning overhead and the house warm behind them. And then they went in together and closed the door on the night. And inside the house that had been built to last, The tea things were washed, and the fire was banked, and the spare room had a light burning in it, and the woman who had come planning to leave and stayed because she chose to move through the rooms that had become hers. Past the shelf where the small primer stood spine out with its kept name inside, past the kitchen table where philosophy had been read aloud on a rainy afternoon, past the window where the branch with white flowers had first told her something she had not yet had words for, and felt in each of these ordinary things the particular weight of a life that had been chosen rather than simply happened, which was, in the end, exactly how such things were supposed to go. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and places are imagined. Any resemblance to actual persons or circumstances is entirely coincidental. The frontier setting, its communities, its landscapes, and its customs are drawn from the broad tradition of Western storytelling rather than from any specific historical record. The themes of this story, the courage required to choose rather than simply to endure, the quiet discipline of presence, the possibility of beginning again, belong to no particular era. They are as old as the human habit of setting out toward unfamiliar country and finding sometimes that the country was not as unfamiliar as expected.